Hello everyone, and on behalf of the Victorian team at the Institute of Architects, I'd like to warmly welcome you to today's Lean In, where we will be looking at unpacking the statement from the heart and the voice to Parliament. My name is Isabel Moy and I'm a graduate at Wawoa Architecture and an AIA Imagine member, and it's my honour to be your host and moderator for today's Lean In session. We're joining from across the country today. We acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land. We acknowledge that it is a privilege to stand on country and walk in the footsteps of those before us, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today's Lean In session is being recorded, so if you miss anything today or have to leave early, we'll be publishing this recording on the Institute's YouTube channel in the next couple of days, and we'll share that link with you in our upcoming email communications. This Lean In session enables you to ask questions, so if you have a question or a comment, please use our Q&A box below to add yours in, and I'll go through these later in the session. Today's session features Uncle Glen Loughrey. Glen is a Wiradjuri man. He's a leader at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University in Canberra and the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne's Educator and advocate for the voice. He's the chairperson of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Anglican Council, the vicar of St Oswald's in Glen, and the artist in residence at St Paul's Anglican Cathedral in Melbourne. Uncle Glen, welcome to our Lean In. It's great to have you with us.
All gone. I hope people can hear me, but Darablinya Bardu Wiradjuri, Yari and Yamanadi Glen Loughrey. Sorry, but I can't see anybody or see where I'm connected. Oh, there we go. Hello, sorry. Good afternoon. I'm sorry there seemed to be a slightly technical glitch on my side of things, and I do apologise for that. But I'm back now. Darablinya Bardu Wiradjuri Yamanadi Glen Loughrey, Yaradu Marang, which is in my language. I'm proud to be Wiradjuri. My name is Glen Loughrey, and Yaradu Marang means good day. My task tonight is to help you to understand the source document from which the voice and recognition referendum has been taken. One of the things we are facing in our country at the moment is that we are thinking about how do we recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people inside the Constitution. We are going to look at enshrining in the Constitution a voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to speak on matters that relate to us. Where does that come from and how did we get there? We have, in some senses, taken what was the source document, the statement from the heart, and lifted out of it one small section without understanding the implications of doing so and the importance of understanding the document, the statement from the heart itself. I'm hoping that you will have read this document. I'm hoping that you will read it regularly to remind yourself of the aspirations for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, not just for themselves, but that they have for this nation. As you may know, the Statement of the Heart was as a result of an ask by the federal government back in 2015 to the Referendum Council, who went and responded to that ask, which was, how do we recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution? To do so, they brought together across the country 12 different dialogues made up of local people, 100 or so people at each place, elders, members of the community. And it took from 2015 to late 2016 to do so, because there was quite a bit of arranging to be done to get people who live outside of urban and metropolitan areas to come and to be able to gather at the various places that the dialogues were held, but also to ensure that those running those dialogues had people who could translate English into the languages of the people who were there. Some were coming and English was their third or fourth language, so there had to be a way of making sure they understood the implications of what they were saying and they were doing. As a result of those dialogues, in 2017, there was a constitutional convention held at Uluru. That convention resulted in writing the statement that you now have. Now, I talk about it not as being the Uluru Statement from the Heart, but the Statement from the Heart written at Uluru. It was actually a statement that came from the hearts of all Australians, from Aboriginal people to all Australians. And if we just talk about it as being Uluru, we tend to think of it just being something coming out of the centre of Australia. But that isn't the case. It was picked up by people who took part in dialogues in the East Coast, as well as in the centre of Australia and Torres Strait Islands. The Statement from the Heart is, I believe, a gentle invitation to transformational forgiveness and compassion, a process of restorative justice and conflict resolution that, if we follow faithfully, will bring about massive change to Australia. Unfortunately, it seems to be caught up in simply the oppositional binary around whether we vote yes or no for the voice. While voice is important, we have to understand that this process, which has been developed and has taken something like 30 or 40 years to come into being, because we began recognition as part of our government's policies and thinking back in the late 70s and 80s. Actual fact, the first petition to Queen Victoria took place in 1846. So this process has been an ongoing and a long process. So what we do is, when we think about the Statement from the Heart, we begin to think about it in this way. It's an invitation, an act of absurd compassion and generosity from a people decimated and dispossessed to those who came here and continue to dispossess. As you read the document, you'll find there are no words in the document that are angry, that place blame on anybody, that put shame on anyone. It simply doesn't seek revenge, or doesn't seek anything. It simply lays down the facts that are about our dispossession, our powerlessness, but it doesn't blame anybody. It doesn't give you guilt, and it doesn't want you to feel shamed. Neither of those are appropriate responses to this document. In it, it uses some very aspirational words like seek twice, like invite, and others that talk about coming together in a relationship, not about coming together in conflict. It's a document that calls us to take part in a process over a number of years to bring about the transformation that we need. It's an act of transformational forgiveness, but like all of those acts, it requires it to be accepted. We do have to say yes. If somebody says to us, I'm offering forgiveness, we have to say, yes, I'll accept it. So the document is very, very gentle. It doesn't come with any of the elements that people seem to overlay on it to make it into a fearful document. What we have here, and I take the statement from the heart because part of the process that came out of the statement of the heart, which was signed by 250 people, most of them who hadn't been to Canberra and don't know where Canberra is, the document picks up the 4 key elements that were brought out as part of the dialogues, and that's voice, treaty, truth, and makarata. I present them here in a circular motion for a reason. Circles are important to Aboriginal people. We do all of our business in yarning circles, or what I would probably better call listening circles, because you listen far more in those than you do actually talk. But they're places where you connect with one another. Circles hold our healing. Circles hold our health. Circle holds together a community. Everywhere, when you're on country, your country is everything that is from horizon to horizon, on the ground and in the air, and therefore it makes a circle. You walk always at the middle of a circle. So this process of following a circle also picks up the idea that there are very few Aboriginal languages that have a word for a straight line. Before what I call BCP, before Cook and Phillip came and the trees were all knocked down, if you were living in the bush, you couldn't walk in a straight line. You'd walk into a tree or a rock, or walk on into a river or off the end of a cliff. So you didn't go about in journeys that followed a straight line. It was a process of moving. You knew where you started from, and you knew where you wanted to get, in a sense, but you were never sure how you were going to do that. You would just begin. It is one of the things that causes issues for people who are non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, in that non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people tend to want to know where they are. They want to know exactly where they're going to finish and exactly what it's going to look like. And they want to know all the risk management issues on the way through, detail. Aboriginal people don't. We go on a wander, on a process, on a journey. So where do we begin to start this process of transformational forgiveness, conflict resolution, restorative justice? We start with voice. Now, voice is this: if you're not heard, you're not seen, and if you're not seen, you don't exist. If you're not heard, you're not seen, and if you're not seen, you don't exist. Those of you who may have a small bundle of joy in your house, you know that when they want you to be aware that they are there, they will make a very loud noise. They will let you know. We need to be heard. If we're not heard, others will speak on our behalf. If we don't exist, others will deal with us in a way that proves that we don't exist. You have heard about the term terra nullius. What I'm talking about here is persona nullius. You're not a real person, and somebody has to speak on your behalf because you don't have a voice. You don't have a voice. One of the little stories I tell to illustrate this is of a little boy about 5 goes to dinner with his parents, and there's mother and father and a couple of siblings, and mum organises everything. They all sit down, and then the waitress comes and says to mum, "What are you having for dinner?" And she said, "I'll have the chicken salad." And dad and the other 2 older children knew what they were having for dinner just then. They were going to be having chicken salad as well. So when the waitress spoke to the father and the 2 children, they all said chicken salad. When they got to the 5-year-old, They looked at she looked at the 5-year-old and said, "What are you going to have to eat, young man?" And he looked for a minute and thought for a minute, and then he said, "I think I'll have a hot dog, thanks." And his mother quickly said, "No, he'll have chicken salad." The waitress looked at the little boy, looked at mum, looked at the little boy, looked at mum, and then said to the little boy, "What sauce would you like with that salad? What sauce would you like with your hot dog?" And the little boy responded very quickly to his mother, "You know, I think she thinks I'm real." That's what a voice does to us. Giving us a voice enshrined in the Constitution, recognises who we are, places us back in the Constitution, which we were never a part of, puts us in the centre of the birth certificate of Australia, and it provides us with recognition. Recognition, being seen, being a part of our country and of that certificate that says Australia, the Constitution. We are a part of that. Putting us inside there, it also allows another very important thing to happen. And that is, there are two kinds of sovereignty at work in Australia. And the statement from the heart talks about those two sovereignties coexisting. When we put what we have in the Constitution now is the hard external sovereignty of the Commonwealth that sits on top of everybody, comes from outside of us, it's imposed upon us. What we want to put beside the Constitution, beside that sovereignty, is the sovereignty of the Aboriginal people, which is relationship-based. Everything we do in Aboriginal communities is about kinship. Who you're responsible to, who's responsible to you, and how you live in that relationship to ensure the wholeness, the circle remains whole, the well-being of all. There is no I in mob. It is all about the other. So this is about relationships, and we put that relationship-based sovereignty alongside the external law-based sovereignty. We begin a conversation that over time will change the way we do law and the way we think about things. It's a very powerful concept. Nobody can take my sovereignty. Nobody can take anybody's sovereignty. I am who I am. I carry in me my country. I can't give that up. We can lose our rights, but we can't lose our sovereignty. So once we've put the voice through, we get recognition through voice enshrined in the Constitution. We then can look at the other three elements that come with the statement from the heart. Now remember, all transformational change takes, as my Canadian Indian friends would say, 7 generations. 7 generations. Now we may not necessarily think of that in terms of time, but what they're saying is it takes a long time to do transformational change. So to do this, we've been about 3 generations into this. We've got about 4 generations to go, perhaps, if we take it in terms of length of time. So we're beginning now with voice. Sometime in the future, as we develop our relationships with one another, we'll move to the place where there is treaty. Now, treaty is simply, once you've recognized somebody is in the space, you have to work out how you live together in that place. Those of us who have been to university and lived in shared houses know that we do that just to survive. We set up all kinds of rules of territory and who can do what, when and how, etc. That's an agreement, that's a treaty. That's a way that we treat with each other to deal with the things that involve both of us. Once we know that there are more than us in the place, once we know that there are others who are equal to us, then we have to find a way to agree how we use what's there. And you can't do treaty with somebody that doesn't exist. So until you hear them and see them and hear their voice, you can't do treaty. By having us inside the Constitution and having a voice on matters that relate to us gives us a sense and a real sense of being real people, equal. We are both equal in this place. Then we can move to a treaty. Most treaties throughout the world have been done on a basis of inequality of power. Most of them were done in places when those who were the colonizers had the upper hand for a whole range of reasons. What we're aiming for here with this is once we are enshrined in the Constitution, we are equal, we do have a voice, that we have a treaty that comes about on a basis of equality and relationship, of moving together to make this real. This is what we call conciliation. Despite our national anthem, which says we're one and free, we are not actually, or never have actually been in that place. We've never actually been one and free. This will begin that process. Once we've done that, we move to the next one, which is truth. Truth these days, when we tell truth telling, is often when Aboriginal people have to get up and take their clothes off in the public and show off their scars, say how terrible things have been, how awful you've been to them. All of that's got elements of truth. All of that tells the story about what happened in this country. But there are another side to truth telling that has to happen as well. It's what I call the colonial memory. Each person watching tonight, from Australia at least, will carry within themselves a sense of a colonial memory. How did I get to be privileged and benefit from the dispossession of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people? And how come those people do not have the privilege and the benefits that I do? It sits like a burr under our saddle. We may not think about it very much, but when we do, it's uncomfortable. Much of the worst stories I hear from people come from older people who tell me stories about their grandfather and their great-grandfather and what happened to Aboriginal people and what they did to Aboriginal people. I have a lady who constantly talks about the fact that her grandfather was the first person to own this particular piece of land, and she keeps asking what happened to the people who were there before. There is within all of us a colonial memory, and I carry it in both sides because I'm my mother's side of the family, landowners, and my father was Aboriginal. So we carry these two places. So truth telling is about how we get to the place where we can say what it feels like to be here, what it feels like to be dealing with that colonial memory, what it feels like to be dealing with the dispossession, what it feels like to be dealing with the trauma that comes in both of us from behind. And once we begin to do that process, we begin to develop an understanding and a sense of empathy about who we are and who the other is. We begin to find ways to connect and to treat each other as being real. We begin to say, right, I get that because I feel like that here. There is that empathy, that place to begin reconciliation. We can't begin reconciliation until we have a sense of equality, until we've worked out how to live with each other, and then until we've been able to say to each other, there are things here that we have to deal with together. Truth telling is where that happens. And much of the truth telling today is simply seen from our side, not from the whole of Australia. It's an important way of understanding how we get to this position. But once we've done that, once we've seen people, we've heard people, we've seen them, we've agreed that we're going to work on this process, then we get to this place where we do actually reconcile through telling truth to each other, where we move out of our heads and into our big brain, as Aboriginal people would say, our gut, where we feel and where we emote, where we feel our emotions. Once we get out of our little brain, we start to have a basis for doing reconciliation. And then we go to Makarrata. And you'll be aware that Makarrata is talked about as coming together after a dispute. It's kind of spoken about as if it's a bit like a Disney movie. People have fought with each other for 2 hours on screen, but they get to the last two scenes and the birds start to sing, the sky softens, the strings start to play, they look in each other's eyes, and they turn and walk away together as if they're going to live happily ever after. Makarrata isn't quite like that in reality. See, this process is based on conflict resolution on justice and wholeness. It's inside our communities from the beginning of time. If we had people who had conflict in a community, we would give them both a voice. They would talk about what happened. Inside a group of elders, around outside of them would be the rest of the community. Everybody's watching on. Once they've had that, they would both agree and come to a treaty with each other about what actually did happen. Then they would go to truth and they would tell what it feels like to be in that place for both of them and for the rest of the community. And the rest of the community can and may have a say there to say, this feels really uncomfortable for us. Remembering our communities were small and any kind of conflict would split them. So we'd have this process here of telling what it feels like. And then someone would decide, it would be decided that someone would have the role of repairing the relationships, repairing what has been broken. And in our communities, that's often was talked about as a spearing. And if the guy throwing the spear was accurate, it usually was a spearing in the thigh. Now, for some people, that sounds brutal, but it's not. It's not as brutal as locking somebody up because of one of these conflicts 500 kilometres away. You can't do Makarrata, you can't do this process on Zoom. It's why we have difficulties with deaths in custody, etc., because this process broken by putting somebody 500 kilometres away in jail breeds dysfunction, breeds self-harm, breeds shame, breeds guilt. And it allows within the community the issues to fester. And then when everybody does come back together, it all goes a little bit haywire. We need to do it as we are there. And don't think that just because you have a spirit on the side that is a punishment. It's not. It's a pedagogical moment. It's a moment of learning. It's a moment of learning that there is no I in mob, because you have to rely on everybody else in that community to look after you, because you can't move and run and do the things you could do. And when you can actually get to a space where you can get around comfortably, you will walk with a bit of a limp. You will walk a little differently. It will also mean that it takes your narcissism out of it. You're no longer the center of the world. Others, including the person who spared you, have a responsibility to care for you. You then begin to learn about the kind of attitudes that put you into that place. And the people watching you from outside, the rest of the community, it's a pedagogical moment for them. It's a learning process for them. So this is learning to walk with a limp. It's not punishment. It's how do we repair what has been broken because we'll all walk a little differently. We'll all walk in a way that reminds us that we're now a different people. We're now different individually and we're different corporately. It's walking with a limp. Not wanting to be religious, but there is a story in the Bible of Jacob who, and some of you will remember from your Sunday school days, Jacob steals Esau's birthright and disappears. And he becomes very, gets lots of family, lots of wives, lots of children, lots of property, and decides to go home 25 years later. But he's not sure how Esau is going to greet him. He gets to the river at Peniel, and being very brave as he is, he sends his wives and children and all the animals on ahead of him to meet Esau, because he wasn't brave enough to do so. And he stays at the river. Overnight, he wrestles with a young person, and sometimes people talk about it being God or an angel or something. But I think in reality, he was wrestling with the young person he was 25 years before when he made that decision to rip off Esau. And when he wakes up in the next morning, he ends up with a dislocated hip. And he walks for the rest of his life, remembering that night when his life changed. And he gets a new name, Israel. He wasn't perfect afterwards, but he remembered that there was a significant cathartic moment in his life. That's what will be the case for us when we get to Makarrata in some generations down the line, that we'll begin to know what needs to be done so that we can repair Australia, not put it back to where it was because it's never been there, but to put it into a new place. And we'll all walk slightly differently. Okay, that covers the kind of processes that we have. And if it's a 7-generational process, the people who are your children and grandchildren are also going to play a significant role in this. It's why I would also like our school children to be voting on this. Unfortunately, they can't, but they would see the importance of this process. Now, I'm just going to go quickly, if we still have time, and if I'm quickly through some frequently asked questions. What is the referendum? Referendum is about constitutional recognition. Every Prime Minister in the 70s, between the 80s and 90s and the 2000s have talked about constitutional recognition for Aboriginal people. That, I suspect, has bipartisan support. The voice is the mechanism of recognition. It gives some sense of power to the people who are sitting in, who have been recognised, power to talk about things that matter to them. It puts some legs on the constitutional recognition. What we're voting for is this, that there should be a body to be called the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Voice. That body may make representations to the Parliament and the executive government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. People get a little bit worried about the executive government thing, but it would be better that we talk to people who are going to be framing the legislation instead of waiting until that legislation is framed and about to be voted on before we have a chance to say, perhaps we need to think about this again. It would mean that we would save some money instead of having to go back and start all over again. It's sort of fairly common sense that we talk about things before we get ourselves into a place where it becomes a difficulty. The Parliament has the right to make the laws with respect to matters relating to the voice, including how it's put together, what's its functions, power, and procedure. It's an interesting thing here, I would say to you, is that we, Aboriginal people in the Torres Strait and Torres Strait Islanders, in the Statement from the Heart, have given you 2 gifts. The first gift that you unwrap says, we give you the gift of saying yes to recognizing us in the Constitution and giving us a voice. We don't demand it. We don't tell you to do it. It's an invitation. It's a gift. And once you've opened that gift up and you've said yes, we then will give you the second gift, which is the opportunity to frame and shape your yes to be fit for purpose via legislation, via your democratic process. This is a very generous process. We don't even tell you how we want it to look and to work. But we do tell you that you have the opportunity to do so. You have the opportunity to say yes and then to make it real. The question is a proposed law to alter the Constitution, and you have the opportunity to answer the question on the bottom. Do you approve this proposed alteration? It's the dating question. When you see somebody that you would like to date or go out with, you go to them and you ask them a question. Would you like to come out with me? And they have two choices, basically, yes or no. And if they say yes, but, they probably mean no. So you have two choices. You'll have two choices. One is yes, one is no. And again, this question really is aimed at what you feel is the right thing to do in this place. Is Australia big enough and mature enough at this stage in its life to put on its big person pants and vote yes to approve this proposed alteration? It's very similar to what happened in 67, but in 67 there were no case. Both parties agreed with it. All the major institutions, including the churches, all supported it. And yet we still only got 91% across the line. So it is a tough call to do what we're doing. It's what we've asked for. It's a permanent advisory body on laws and policies impacting First Peoples. Permanent advisory body. Permanent, so that we can have a long-term view about things that matter to us. We're not impacted by the 3-year or 4-year political cycle. And it's advisory. We don't tell you what to do. We advise you. Advisory. Consists of First Peoples representatives, and the government will decide the best way in which to make that happen, although there are plenty of models in place, such as that which you can find in the Carmel-Langton report. And it's unable to block legislation. It can't stop you from doing what you want to do. It doesn't deliver services, and it doesn't manage government funding. We leave the management of money to the experts, the governments. Why do we need constitutional change? Pretty simply, we've had 5 bodies who've done a similar bit of work for us over the years, the last of that being ATSIC, and it was abolished without the consent of the Australian people, but with the support of the politics of the day. When we have different politicians in place, we have different ideologies and therefore different expectations of bodies such as ATSIC, and they come and they go. What we want to do is allow us to have effective long-term solutions on perennial issues. We constantly talk about the issues that we see in Alice Springs, or the issues we see in remote communities, and even the issues that are impact upon us in the cities. How do we resolve those? One of the important things is to get a stable long-term worldview on these matters, have a long-term solution, to work towards an outcome without expecting instantaneous responses because we put money towards it. You can't resolve an issue by the model that has actually created the issue in the first place. this is the kind of issues we're talking about. 13-year-old spends 45 days in solitary confinement, 22 in succession. Not a good thing to do, but that's not unusual for our people. And particularly in places like Queensland with the new bail laws, and we have problems with that here in Victoria. But in Queensland, in new bail laws, children who may not be at home at 9 o'clock at night will be taken back to remand. And 22% of them who have that kind of impact are Aboriginal children, even though we're only 7% of that population. We need a long-term view to solve those issues. We know where we've been able to do that. That has made a massive impact. And that's what this is about. Do we need more detail? No, we don't, because what we're doing is we're putting a head of power in the Constitution. The Constitution carries inside it, basically, when it comes to what the government wants to do, a series of head of powers. If you look at your Constitution, it's not that exciting because it doesn't give you a lot of detail. Head of power are enacted in legislation. So we put in the Constitution a statement. That statement is taken to Parliament. That Parliament then legislates where they do the detail. And in the detail there, that have an A in there somewhere, where detail is added and tested in the High Court. It's what we do, and it's what we do with every other piece of legislation that turns up. Just to give you an example, here's the tax law. Taxation, but so as not to discriminate between states or parts of states. This is the second clause inside section 51. There are 39 of them. All look a little like that. And you and I know that the taxation law now could fill a very large building. It's been developed over the years, and it is often tested at the High Court to talk about whether the government has the right to make that law. Now, it's not whether the law is a good law or a bad law. It's whether the government has the right to make the law. So we don't need detail. The people who are often talking about us needing detail will be the ones actually doing it. In our parliament at the moment, the Labor Party has majority in the lower house, but not in the upper house. So each and every person in Parliament has the opportunity to have an impact on how this looks. They will put the detail in. We once again have to know, does it feel right to make this law possible? This question is about what about immigrants and does it divide by race? Well, here's a little statement by Alfred Deakin, who was the Attorney General and the architect of the Constitution. He became Prime Minister for three different times. And this is a statement that he made. A little more than 100 years ago, Australia was a dark continent in every sense of the term. There was not a white man within its borders. In another century, the probability is that Australia will be a white continent with not a black or even a dark skin amongst its inhabitants. The Aboriginal race has died out in the south and is dying fast in the north and west, even where most gently treated. Other races are to be excluded by legislation if they are tinted to any degree. There's a lot of things I'd like to ask Alfred if I get a chance to meet him in the other life, wherever they will both be, because it's really just reminds us, and he's not the only one, the other politicians at the beginning of our nation, 1901, all held similar views, very similar views. And we have to accept that our country has been built on race, and that what we want to do when we make the changes to the Constitution is to unite without race being the central issue. Immigrants and refugees who come here are recognised as equals. There's no white Australia policy, and they benefit from the dispossession of the first people. They do benefit from the fact that they can have houses, they can have jobs, they can have careers, they can have whatever. They can benefit from what has been built on the dispossession of Aboriginal people. So I don't see it as dividing. I see it as uniting, because race was the basis of the first foundational basis of the Constitution and of our nation right from the very beginning. Do all First Peoples support the voice? The answer to that question is no, and they shouldn't. There's no need for them to. First of all, statement from the heart containing these four aspirational processes is addressed to non-Aboriginal people, not Aboriginal people. It's our invitation to you. You're the one that has to make the decision. And for Aboriginal people, why would they be necessarily supportive of governments in this place due to things like stolen generation, incarceration, broken promises, failures to provide the basic elements of life? So I would say that most Aboriginal people have a good reason not to support, but 83% do. 83% do. And I think from latest figures, it's gone up a little bit further than that. But up 83% from 80%, that's 2.7% of the total population support the voice. But if we take one of the latest polls, it's not the latest one, it's down even further than this, but let's remember, just take this for example, if it's 53% or it's 43%, take out 2.7% to get the real figure of non-Indigenous people supporting the voice. And that's the concern we have. Aboriginal people do. Aboriginal people are in favour of this. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, 83% support the voice. What you have to be careful of is you don't allow that small group of Aboriginal people to be an excuse for not doing the right thing. Just going to finish with 2 slides and then you have time for questions. Just so that you remember that Australia is not just Aboriginal, it's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. And there are 4, the Torres Strait Islanders have written their own statement, the Massig Statement from the Deep. The 4 main aims outlined in the Massig Statement are to achieve self-determination, freely determine political status, pursue economic, social and cultural development, self-government, create partnerships with all that are relevant, governments and others. And they believe that once the voice of the parliament is there, it will allow them to build on that to develop these important goals for themselves. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander are very different people. They have very different experiences of colonisation, and they have a very different understanding of who they are. And that is fine, and that's the way it should be. So we have to make sure that we are aware that they will be looking at other things as well once the voice comes into being. The final thing is to look at some of the no voices. Why are people saying no? Why are some of these people saying no? For people like Jacinta and Warren and the Conservative no, it's basically I would describe as being a neo-conservative or a neoliberal understanding that they are working from, that people have responsibilities to look after themselves, to do things that make life better for themselves, that if we resolve the issues, people can lift themselves up and can achieve. Both Jacinta and Warren are very clear about that in their own thinking. They see that they've achieved through their own self-determination and courage and capacity to make things happen. And they don't want to see, and one of the things that Jacinta would say is that she doesn't want to lock people into a deficit state, don't want to she would say that she didn't need anyone to help her to get to where she was. She wants other people to be able to do the same thing. It's about solving issues, not necessarily about providing people with the opportunity to make decisions about themselves. The process in that is, it's easy, it's difficult for some people to lift themselves out of a process of dispossession and trauma because they fail to have the basic capacity to do so. They have been so dispossessed that they find it hard. But that's the position that they come from, and it's fine. They want economic development and they want self-development from people. Lydia Thorpe and the progressive no is completely different to any of the other no's in this process. They have a view that this doesn't go far enough, that they want to have self-determination and sovereignty, Black sovereignty, and they want to be able to have power over decisions made. It's based on the work of Michael Mansell, goes back to the Black Power movements of the 1970s. It's talking about having an Aboriginal state where we would vote, Aboriginal people would vote for Aboriginal people to say have a block of Aboriginal people in the Senate. That may be seen to be unworkable, but it's not unusual. It has happened in other places around the world. And in New Zealand, there is a certain number of seats given for Maori. So it's not something that hasn't been done elsewhere. Bolivia has rewritten its constitution to include indigenous people, and there's been similar processes in other countries. So she is on wanting much more than what we've been offered, and she's not one of the she couldn't be further away from where Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine are. The Liberal in detail is this process of saying we want to know where we're going to, and we want to know all the detail about it so we can do risk management on the way through. We want to be able to know what we are dealing with, and we want to know where we are when we get there. It's that very linear worldview, very different to the circle that I showed you at the beginning. I've talked about the mob, our people, and then we have the yes buts. They're the people who seem to agree with the fact that we need a voice, but have a lot of questions about things. Change this clause, shift that word, whatever else there is in it. And they're the kind of people, and you'll read their material, Frank Brennan, Greg Craven and others. While they are yes at one level, they want this to be a yes that they're comfortable with. And I suspect for all of us, even those that are hard locked on yes people, the process that we're about to go through will be uncomfortable. And it's supposed to be. It's supposed to change us. It's supposed to shift us. We're supposed to learn how to walk with a limp. We're supposed to be able to find ways to give up some of our privilege, give up some of our demands, and find ways to be together. It's not a simple or gentle process, and it shouldn't be. We have to work through this together, and this will bring us together as a nation in a way no other thing can. But we have to be open to the possibility. If you want more information, there is a QR code that you can download. That goes to my website, and there's quite a lot of information and websites that you can go to from there. So that brings us to the end of that part of the process. Question time.
Thanks, Glenn. That was great. If anyone has any questions, you can just type them into the question box at the bottom of the screen. But I think you did a good job of answering all the questions, Glenn, already. So
maybe not. I'm sure there are other questions or people who have something they'd like to get more information about.
Okay, I've got a question actually, Glenn. I guess I was wondering what sort of us as architects or as individuals, other than voting yes, what else we could be doing if we wanted to show our support for the voice.
Having conversations with friends. Obviously, we'd be looking for organisations to come out and support it. Maybe that's practices, maybe that's groups of people, but it's really, reconciliation is a contact sport. It's one-on-one. It's getting down to conversations with your friends, getting down to conversations with your colleagues at work, just talking it through and talking through, how you feel about it. What, in those contexts, what are your concerns and what needs to be addressed? Having those relational conversations. Of course, you can, if you're a walker, stick some flyers in people's mailboxes as you go past. But it's really about having some kitchen table conversations, getting some friends around to sit with you and talk about things. And when you do that, remember that this is about relationships. Don't have an argument. Don't have an argument. The moment you have an argument, you've lost, they're lost. It's never going to go anywhere. Maintain the relationship. Help them to unpack why they think the way they do, and help yourself by saying to them, well, yes, I understand how you feel because I felt like that, but then I looked at this or I learned that. Help people to process through this. It's a difficult thing to do, and you don't want people just to lock themselves back into a defensive mode. Okay?
That's great. Yeah, thanks, Glenn. That's great. We have 2 questions that have come through. First question, ATSIC was dissolved through bipartisan decision because it was deemed to be ineffective and systemically broken. What's to stop the voice becoming another ATSIC?
Well, I would look back at ATSIC and say it probably wasn't as systemically broken as people, as political people may have thought so. And I think that's one of the issues there. I think one of the reasons why this won't become anywhere like that, people who are on The Voice will change over on a regular basis. You don't get a chance to stay there and be there for a long period. You get to move out. There will be, again, the opportunity for governments through legislation to rectify any of the things that they see that are malfunctioning, dysfunctional. This will be a work in progress. Some of the accusations made against organisations like ATSIC and others had to do with the programs they were running, what was happening with money, all of that kind of stuff. We've taken all that out immediately at the beginning. We don't do programs. We don't handle money. We look straight and only at what's on the table in Parliament, and we respond to that.
Awesome. There's another question. What is the issue with the term executive government in the amendment? What is the problem with it?
The problem is that people see the people who are complaining about it will see it as being a way to clog up the processes of democracy, of people making decisions, because everybody on the way through may be required to listen to the voice on this matter, and therefore it will slow things down. there are 819 different lobbyists who got a free card to Canberra, to Parliament House in the last 12 months or so. So they can walk in and talk to all these people on behalf of their paid clients. This process goes on all the time. It won't block that up, because I would think that people in those positions in executive government who are making legislation will want to be sure that what they're doing is going to work and isn't going to be argued about, isn't going to be pulled apart. And I don't see, and again, it's up to the government to say, do executive government have to talk to Voice? Or are they only required to listen if Voice says to them, here, I think this could be done a different way or a better way? Nobody has to listen. But there is this concern that somehow it'll clog up the process. And I fully doubt that it will.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. So I think everyone's just really happy that you gave this talk, a lot of praise. So thanks, Glenn. So thanks everyone for joining. Just a reminder that lean-ins are recorded to view later. You can receive notifications of when new lean-ins are available to view by subscribing to the Australian Institute of Architects YouTube channel, which is YouTube at Oz Architects. So thanks so much, Glenn.
Okay, my pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.